Kia ora koutou, and thank you for joining us this evening or morning, depending on where you are in the world, for this international speaker series with Tatiana Filatova. I hope those of you joining us from Aotearoa in lockdown are keeping safe and well. Ko Charlie Keeling-Aho. I'm a senior advisor in the communications and engagement team at the Commission, and I'll shortly explain how the session will run today. But before I do that, I'm going to ask Bevan Hunter, Principal Advisor in our Māori Corporate Services team, to lead us into this session with a karakia. Kia ora, Bevan.
Oh, kia ora. It's saying my internet is unstable, but I'll have a go. Ngā mihi nui kia koutou, I runga I te pāka whakata reo nei, tēnā koutou katoa. He mihi tino nui kia koe Tatiana, tēnei te mihi, nei rā te mihi, anei he karakia. I te hui nei, whaia te mātaranga kia marama, kia whai take, ngā mahi katoa, tū maia, tū kaha, aroha atu, aroha mai, tātou ia tātou katoa, tihei mauri ora. So for those of us who speak English, let's, for this gathering, seek knowledge for your understanding, have purpose in all that you do, stand tall, be strong, let us show respect for each other, behold the breath of life. And a special greeting to you, Tatiana. Thank you very much. Kia ora.
Kia ora, Bevan, thank you. So before we kick off, and those of you who are familiar with our sessions will be used to this, it would be really great if you could please write your name and the organisation or community you represent into the chat box while I'm talking, and let us know where you're joining us from in Aotearoa. Since we can't see your faces, it's always really good to know who we have participating in these sessions. This is the 8th session in our International Speaker Series, and we're very privileged to have Tatiana join us today alongside Commissioners Dr. Judy Lawrence and Dr. Harry Clark, who are leading this session for us today. Judy is a leading expert in Aotearoa on climate change adaptation and is also coordinating lead author for the IPCC 6th assessment report currently underway. Harry is an internationally recognised science leader in greenhouse gases research. He is well regarded in the primary sector, both from a science and agribusiness perspective. I'll shortly hand over to Judy to introduce Tatiana properly before we have a chance to hear from Tatiana on her work. This will be followed by a short discussion between Judy, Harry and Tatiana before you have the chance to get your questions answered using our audience Q&A. You should see a Q&A box at the bottom of the screen where you can type your questions throughout. We might not have a chance to cover all the questions in this session, but we'll try to get to as many as we can. And if you'd like to speak to each other or share your thoughts, please feel free to use the chat. It's always really good to see your conversations, and it can be a great place to share your thoughts and any helpful resources. I also want to let you know we are recording this session, so anyone who is unable to make it is able to watch it on our website afterwards. So that's enough from me. I'm now going to hand over to Judy.
Kia ora tātou, haere mai, and welcome everybody. This is an auspicious moment because we're locked down in New Zealand, and we see we have a very large audience to welcome our speaker from Europe, from the Netherlands. And it gives me great pleasure to introduce Tatiana Filatova, who is Professor of Computational Economics at Delft University of Technology in the Netherlands, and has an association with the University of Technology in our neighbouring country in Sydney, Australia. She also serves as the academic lead of the climate change governance theme at TU Delft climate action program. Now, Tatiana has a particular background in understanding and researching the role of behaviour change in climate change. And we thought that this was of great interest to us in New Zealand. We know that behaviour change is critical to dealing with both emissions reductions and also dealing with the impacts of climate change in our adaptation decision making. So who better than to talk with us tonight than Tatiana Filatova, and I'll hand over to you and we'll get going. So thank you, Tatiana.
Thank you very much, Judy, Bevan and Charlie. Thank you, everybody. And indeed, good evening, good afternoon, good morning to you. First of all, I would like to say thanks to the Commission for the invitation and for all the important work that you are doing. I think it's also quite exceptional for the government to rely on such a wide advice from practitioners and from scientists. So it's really a compliments for the work that you are doing. And indeed, so I'll try to share my screen and start a presentation. So do you see my screen?
Yes, that's good. If you just enlarge it.
Yes.
That's it. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. Because I don't see you anymore, please tell me if there is something. It's indeed a pleasure for me to talk today, and the topic which I would like to discuss and share some findings with you, something what research has found so far, is really about behavioral change. And as Judy indeed mentioned, so major transformations in the society are required to address the problem of climate change, both on the mitigation and the adaptation side. And that inevitably means that we need to do something about our behavior, but also maybe about our social institutions. So let me begin. So of course, you're very well familiar, or many of you, I guess, in this audience are very well familiar with the range of IPCC reports, and the one that has been published just about 3 weeks ago on the physical science basis. It's quite clear that the current state of climate and the possible futures are not very, are looking quite gloomy unless we take action, and urgent action. So both, and now it's the discussion is not anymore only about the mitigation, of course, and as also the subsequent reports will show, but also adaptation is becoming way more important, because the processes in the climatic system that we have already initiated will continue for the next several decades, and we would have to adapt to them irrespectively of the mitigation action. The mitigation would, of course, decrease the cost of adaptation. So it would the attention. So indeed, today I will talk about first in general a bit in general about mitigation and adaptation. But the examples that I will be showing will be primarily related to adaptation. While within our team we worked also on behavioral change and how that could help address mitigation targets. So please do ask questions and come back to that during the question and answer session if that's of interest. But what's important on either of the sides of the action is that something has to happen on multiple scales. So it's the governments, of course, and the governmental action, but also households, businesses, farmers, practically everybody who is going to experience the effect and contribute into emitting CO2 and other gases has to take action. Of course, attention came back a bit towards the adaptation from the beginning of the year with the launch of the Climate Adaptation Summit also that came by. But okay, if we look at this multi-level system where governments at all scales have to interact with the private sector, the first question probably that we want to just make sure we know is why should we even consider private actions? They are, of course, businesses, farmers, households are, of course, agents of change, but how important are they in the whole process? Well, first of all, I think the first statement which I would like to make is that government policy actually has to be aligned with private motives, because that has to do a lot with, for example, in adaptation with socially constructed limits, or what policy is going to be acceptable. And we've seen that, of course, playing out negatively against governments if they really do not consider that while taking the action. Second point is that sometimes governmental policies would have consequences that are unintended. Let's say on the mitigation side, we of course know about the rebound effect, and on the adaptation side, for example, we heard about things like levee effect when governments try to protect, let's say, flood-prone zones. to reduce flood risk, while in fact that attracts even more population and capital at stake. But the good side of this is that there are also different additional policy instruments which we could use to remediate the unintended consequences. And I won't go into the details here at this moment, but they do exist and they do work by actually tipping into the individually driven motivation from the, let's say, household side. So of course, we also need to speed up the action to close the mitigation and adaptation gaps on both sides. And that also means that governments alone and the whole implementation of the policies has to be really backed up from the bottom up. We know also that neither of the sides of climate change response is going to be unaffordable for the governments alone, and businesses and individuals have to also participate in that because they also benefit from the action. And we also know by now already that actually, while private action may seem very minor and might come across maybe as a white noise, but in fact, because there are thousands, hundreds of thousands, and sometimes millions of people participating in them, the cumulative effects of these actions could be actually quite significant. For example, there has been a study to look into behavioral climate change mitigation that actually estimated that just moderate behavioral change could reduce CO2 footprint by 16% and reduce the costs of achieving climate goals for the European Union by 30%. That's quite substantial. On the other hand, on the climate, if we look into behavioral adaptation, into how actually, if we can consider adaptation not as optimization process, but actually rely on the empirical evidence on how adaptation goes on, this study has estimated that it was applied to farmers adapting to droughts, and they found out that actually when we consider empirically specified behavior on adaptation, the adaptation that we thought would occur is quite overestimated, actually by 1/3. And that also underestimates loss and damage, of course, from climate change. So all of this is very important, I hope, and I hope to come back on this if you would also have some other examples or questions. But okay, but how do we do this? So if we know that social dimension of climate change is important, and we want to look into how individuals make decisions, of course, the common approach to do that was to consider individuals as rational optimizers with perfect information who are all the same at this, and make decisions in a similar manner. Of course, we know very well that's not the case. For example, all the empirical evidence in climate adaptation and mitigation studies, which we usually collect through, let's say, households or farmer surveys, role-playing games, participatory exercises to elicit conceptual maps, cognitive maps, lab experiments, social media, and even standard market data or census data that increasingly go into capturing more social and behavioral factors in those surveys. We do know that actually individuals make decisions in a boundedly rational manner. They learn, they adapt, and they're all diverse. And this is good to know, but if we actually want to understand what does it mean for the city, for the region, for the country, we need to aggregate it in some way. And one of the ways to do this is computational agent-based modeling. It's practically a computational approach when we code in all these behavioral attributes and processes in a computer code and create thousands or millions of these artificial agents representing real people as avatars, more or less, and want to see what would be the implications for climate mitigation or adaptation policies. So I've been using this method a lot in my work. And practically we could combine it with different environmental data, spatially explicit, different social data, but do specify these decisions of these individuals in a very explicit way, using different decision heuristics, using learning explicitly, using interactions with other individuals, social institutions, environment, you name it. And for example, we recently reviewed agent-based models applied to flooding. And as you could see, a variety of different stakeholders are represented in these models, really starting from households and farmers to government, insurers, developers. And they are represented in a variety of ways. So within my team, we worked on different projects. And of course, I don't have time to look at to discuss all of them, but I just wanted to mention that we also looked into farmers and into mitigation. But today I would like to only show you two examples from the case related to flooding. So specifically how floods influence housing market and how actually the social dynamics could amplify the specific risks and tip markets into a different state, and also the role of firms in adaptation and in addressing hazards. So first, let me just show you a few slides about what we have done, given understanding that actually households are not rational optimizers, but all these different behavioral attributes are at play. We wanted to understand, we also know a number of empirical facts about how, let's say, how the property markets react to flood risks. In fact, all hazard risks. Usually what we do know is that, of course, waterfront, for example, offers lots of amenities, but they're especially correlated with these hazard risks. The same actually is with wildfires, for example. And currently we do, given the current state of climate, we do value amenities a lot. That's captured as willingness to pay in the price. It adds sometimes 30% to the price of the property, while risks, when they are known to people, could reduce property prices maybe between 5 to 10%. So it's not comparable to what amenities add. However, every time after a hazard event, this risk perception is updated in the sense that we observe the further drop of property prices. Even if disaster didn't actually hit, it's a near miss, so there was no physical damage, prices still drop, but these effects disappear within 5 to 6 years after the event. And what is actually proposed or at least anticipated is that with climate change and continuing urbanization, which happens usually along the waterfront as well, you could actually observe a reverse trend in this on the market. So we were quite curious to understand when do these behavioral changes actually matter, such as, let's say, changes in risk perceptions, in subjective risk perceptions, and what are the social mechanisms driving these changes at the system level. So we developed an agent-based model. So it's a spatial model where we could actually upload the maps of the city itself with lots of data. And we use also, this model was applied to coastal cities in the US. So we had 17 years of housing transactions with several hurricanes in between happening. And we could program the behavior of buyers, sellers, and real estate agents in a very behaviorally rich way, and combine that with the market dynamics. So for example, buyers would choose where to live, but they also have to have mortgage attached to that, to the house they're buying. They're also boundedly rational, so they don't perceive risk subjectively, and they have memory that is fading. Sellers could, for example, also adjust their ask prices if they see a lot of demand or a drop in demand for their property. And real estate agents would be monitoring these shifts in the market. So what the model in general produces is something like it could produce dynamics of prices under different assumptions about behavior and hazard intensity. So, and the example which I want to show you is, of course, relates, I'll skip the slide, sorry, just looking at that time. The example, so what I wanted to show you is that actually what happens when individuals learn about increasing intensity of hazards. For example, we also ran a survey in the US just after Hurricane Harvey, separately among buyers and sellers, and captured in statistical functions, did statistical analysis, what sort of factors influence their decisions, whether to buy or sell, and how much to bid or ask, and whether or not to locate further in the flood zone. And very briefly, there's the whole paper about this, but briefly, what's important is that, for example, buyers, if they experience a flood event, their fear about floods actually increases a lot and overtakes the rational cognitive process. So they do not anymore care that much about the monetary side of the deal, but they just want to avoid the flood zone. Same happens with sellers. So we coded, for example, this type of behavior in the model. And we observe how market evolves as in two scenarios, in two cases, actually, in two coastal towns. In one had very few properties in the flood zone, just barely above 6%, and the other had nearly 50% of the property in the flood zone. And we run a model with two consecutive floods, one after another in 4 years, just before the memory fades away. And what we're plotting here are the average price in the flood zone. And as you could see, so just immediately after the hazard, the first flood, the prices drop and they barely recover in the city with lots of properties impacted. While the other town where there are only few, the prices recover barely, actually quite okay, until the next flood hits. And what we observe actually in the market, if I tell you a bit in the simplified form, given the time, what happens is that actually market expectations change in these cities as fear propagates. So as households start to know that actually floods are coming again and there is no time for recovery, the demand for properties in the flood zone drops significantly. And that also leads to the price drop in the hazard zone, which is irreversible, at least for the town that is very much impacted. But what's worse is, of course, as prices drop, practically low-income households are outpriced from the safe zone because no matter how much they bid, they cannot ever win the house because middle and high-income households would overbid them on the market. So they have to locate in the flood zone. And also those with mortgages which they didn't pay out would also be trapped in the flood zone, which that leads to the increase of poverty in the flood zone, actually in both cities, irrespectively of the number of floods. That leads, just to bring this story, to summarize the story, that the whole path dependency and the social amplification of risk overlapped with what markets do to fixing it, actually leads to social segregation and climate gentrification in these areas. But of course, relocation is not the only adaptation strategy households choose, and in fact, it's the least desired, the last one, the least popular, the last one they would go into. Adaptation, autonomous adaptation of households could take several forms. They could, of course, do structural measures, also non-permanent measures, take insurance, or just seek for information. And there are lots of surveys done to understand what drives these adaptation decisions of households. But we reviewed 56 of the surveys done around the world. But what we see that many of them are done in the rich world, so to say. So this is the GDP per capita across the world, and this is the number of surveys run in those different countries. Why this matters? Because in fact, different factors that are found to drive adaptation of households actually vary a lot across countries, as you could see. So from this meta-analysis we did, so each factor contribution, positive or negative, to driving adaptation intentions actually varies a lot. And we also understood that it varies a lot depending on the culture. Let's say more individualistic and power distance and uncertainty avoidance attributes of society actually influence whether and how a household adaptation will take place. I see I have about 3 minutes left, so I'll try to speed up. What we are doing currently, we're actually running longitudinal surveys on household adaptation in different locations. and ask them a number of questions, including different adaptation actions, insurance and relocation. We're also trying to trace the intention behavior gap, because you could only ask about intention if you do it in one shot. But and we are now finishing the third wave of the survey. And we have been capturing actually surveys when people are experiencing events between the survey waves, and hopefully, so we're analyzing this at the moment. What I want to share with you at the moment is the analysis of the first set of the surveys, where we looked into a number of factors. Again, things like probability and damage, whether they actually influence adaptation, so more sort of cognitive process, and all sort of social and behavioral factors that influence it as well. So what we do, so we have the surveys in 4 countries, about 6,000 respondents, and we run a statistical analysis to explain whether intention is explained by any of these factors below. And what we find actually is that calculated risk, so probability and damage, matters very little. So actually, given the uncertainty intervals here, the effect is literally null on the adaptation intention of households. What matters a lot for households to start thinking about adaptation is actually how much worried they are about everything happening. So we have found several other things, but what I would like also to bring attention to is that actually flood experience did not matter in any of the 3 countries except the Netherlands, where the flood events are rare. In all the other 3 countries we surveyed and the areas where we surveyed them, floods actually occur almost annually. So people become so accustomed to them that they do not that the flood experience doesn't serve anymore as a driver of adaptation. And another thing which I would like also to bring attention to is that, for example, information from general media is not influencing decisions anywhere except Indonesia, where it actually discourages people to adapt. But what does influence is the social media and the social influence in general. So what people that matter to a respondent think about adaptation and about hazards mattered a lot and influence positively adaptation intentions. I'll just go show all these results at once. So actually lots of people in our sample did take adaptation already. And we found that beliefs in climate change happening now actually influence adaptation intentions very significantly. But negatively, meaning that people who have been believing in climate change have already taken the action. What we also find is that taking low effort action like information seeking and etc., doing something in your community may reduce intention for high effort structural adaptation of your own property, and so on. In the last maybe 2 minutes, I would like 1 minute. I would just like to show you some earlier findings, which we did also when looking beyond households. So in fact, we know that historically cities developed along the water because there are strong agglomeration forces, and when people, let's say individuals and businesses come together, there are actually a lot of knowledge and technology spillovers. That's why settling in big cities is actually very beneficial for both households and firms. But as you probably also know, this summer, quite a few countries, the whole G7 said actually started to require compulsory disclosure of climate risk by businesses. That might influence decisions of firms significantly. So in this case, we also run a model where we had a very stylized coastal region and inland region and modeled behavior of firms and households simultaneously. It's an evolutionary economic model, meaning that there is actually learning happening in the model. And for example, when more firms are locating together, they can invest more in research and development, innovation spread, they're becoming more productive, and they actually attract more households. And they create more value added. So the GDP of the entire two-region economy in this case grows. So I would like to only highlight a few things here. So what we are plotting here are the number of firms in the coastal region. So more or less to see whether, and they start being equal more or less, with only a small trade advantage for the coastal region. But there is the population in two regions is equal, but over time, majority of them, in majority of the cases, even despite floods, of different intensity of probability move to the coastal region. But GDP varies a lot, and we're actually talking about the interplay of this creative destruction and hazard losses. So of course, hazard losses is something familiar. When the flood hits, it destroys infrastructure, machinery, etc. Firms lose profits, but creative destruction is an effect that is really driven by innovation. Because firms have to replace part of their machinery, they're actually investing in a better infrastructure than before, better productive factors than before, and that makes them more competitive. And even in the case, let's say, of low probability, low severity floods, you could see actually a boost of development still along the coast. But what's important is that when floods become high probability, high probability, low severity, with low probability, high severity shock, that's where we would protect, for example, the coastal region, we would see a little drop maybe in the population, but not significant, still close to the baseline with no floods whatsoever. But the GDP would decrease over the years because actually the economy is hit, because over time, a lot of capital will be exposed to this high severity flood. I'll have to skip this, and I would like to just bring your attention to this one slide, the last slide, with the results where we were also playing the scenario, what happens with households, population, firms, population, and GDP over time if, let's say, we go through mild, low probability, low severity shock or no floods at all, to a scenario when climate change exacerbates and either takes a step change, let's say a tipping point in the climate system is reached, and when it becomes gradual. And what we see is that households, when actually over time climate severity and probability start to grow, it leads to an outflow of households, but not all leave, of course, and the stagnation of the population of firms. But of course, GDP is impacted very badly, especially in the first period when practically hazards start to occur more often and more severe, and the economy has no time to recover. Over time, they do move to the inland region, which actually highlights once again the importance of the timely retreat. So with this, I would like to finish my talk and just leave you with some key takeaways in the sense that government and policy should account for private motivation, or at least nudge it in the right direction if we know how it works. Private action could have substantial cumulative effects. And what with respect to adaptation, we actually, probabilities and damages do not really matter for the individual decisions so far, only when they are processed with some narratives where some emotional component is added up to that. There are some drivers of adaptation that are universal across countries, but there are also context-dependent drivers. And markets amplify behavioral biases. And when left without governmental interventions, they actually could lead to climate gentrification. But that retreat can also be beneficial if taken on time. And for example, when firms or households are nudged into safe locations. So with this, I would like to say thanks also to the team of students, great students who have been working with me on this, and would welcome your questions and the discussion, of course, with Judy and Harry. Thank you. I'll stop sharing.
Okay, thank you very much, Tatiana. That was a very quick run through of some very complex things, but I think the take-homes are very helpful and very relevant to what we're thinking about here. And in particular, one of the sort of questions I'd like to follow up with is really how in your work, whether you've looked at the impact of behaviour interventions and whether or not they're effective and what their limitations might be when we're looking at system change for climate change?
Yes, thank you, Judy. That's a very important question. Indeed, we did look at some of the interventions to alter behavior, and of course, you have the set of standard tools like market-based instruments. I don't know, insurance or subsidies and taxes, but we did run, for example, one that was the study about behavioral mitigation, when we looked actually at behavioral change of households and how could they reduce their CO2 footprint by either investing in insulation or solar panels versus changing their habits, or versus just switching to a, I don't know, green electricity provider. And what we did find that these market-based instruments like subsidies, for example, would help. But we also run a scenario with information policies when, for example, some information diffuses in the community. So it's a bit more complex, but the summary is that there was a diffusion of information about effectiveness and importance of addressing climate change among households and effectiveness of different measures. And when these information policies are combined with market-based policies, the emission reduction driven by behavioral change alone is actually way more significant. It almost doubled the individual effects of the two, for example.
Okay, thank you. Harry, do you want to carry on for a minute?
Yeah, just one question I had was, does your work look at the interaction between individual behavior change and the individuals who are affected and their ability and desire to change policies such that the individual cost is in actual fact transferred to broader society? And I'm thinking very much about sea level retreat, when those individuals will have large stranded assets, and the reaction may be to try and influence policy for flood protection, seawall protection, such that they are protected from the impacts.
Yes, Harry, that's really, that's sort of probably the hottest topic in science, at least at the moment. So because we do observe that happening in reality, indeed. There are let me disentangle it in two parts. First of all, whether we looked at, there is quite some research on cost sharing of both mitigation and adaptation policies. And indeed, so because it's not, yes, we tend to think maybe that governments have to solve it for us, but it's us buying things, us consuming, us making choices. Firms react to what us consumers or households are doing. So our actions are inevitably making influence, having an influence on this. So there is research on how to align let's say, with respect to floods, the coastal retreat, for example, how to align and how to create these cost sharing schemes that do benefit from the already existing motivations of households and firms, for example, while creating the right signals for them, let's say, to take action over time, for example. That might mean that, yes, over time property prices would fall, but let's say they would fall gradually, and they could be maybe subsidized once, but it's not that you have, as a government, you have to recover all the time the same area, so the costs are lower. With respect to lobbying specific decisions, there is indeed increasing research on that. We in fact starting a project in September that looks at the feedbacks between what policies are brought to, let's say, what type of proposals are brought to the governmental agenda, whether how are they discussed, and what decisions, what policy change is taken place, given the voters' reward and given the short-term orientation of maybe governments that have to be re-elected. Let me put it this way. Yeah. versus longer term climate policy goals. Yeah.
Yeah, that runs on to another question, I think, which is really about governments leading or governments responding to the populace, and the extent to which you've had any evidence about governments leading and the impact that can have on adaptation that is ongoing and can be sustainably managed over time.
Yes, Judy, yes. I don't have an evidence example at the back of my head in terms of successful, let's say, but I'm an environmental economist, not a policy governance person. So it's, I'm very interested, and I'm collaborating with governance people, but I'm not the expert maybe on the on these examples. But what I think, given at least what we know about what drives individual firms, individual households, individual farmers in let's say the adaptation actions, it's quite clear that they do need information. And they do need information that is not just, I mean, I think, for example, climate services are doing an excellent service in that sense, in that case, that they are trying to downscale climate scenarios and show what will be the probabilities and etc. But this information is to drive for people to prompt them into actions, because they don't really relate too much to probabilities or even to damages unless they see a storyline, a narrative around that. And that's also, that's quite consistent.
Yeah, okay. I think given the time, we better move on to some of the audience's questions. And we've got a few questions here about how to increase individual climate action, which, you know, through driving behaviour, and moving away from the information deficit model where we communicate and increase awareness and those types of interventions. And to date, there's question marks over the extent to which they are working. And we're just interested to know how that has worked out in your research, and whether you can comment on moving from improving information, raising awareness, and actually changing behaviour.
Yes. So I actually do very much. So a lot of research that we do have now measures all these behavioral factors as a one-shot assessment. So it's like a snapshot of the situation. And usually what we know is what people say they think influences their decision. So what we are doing currently is actually tracing, questioning the same households over time. And with this, we would like to understand whether they actually have taken action which they thought they would take in the next year, and what influenced them not taking or not taking that action. So, but what we noticed, so I cannot, so we don't have yet the results of the analysis. We just got the data, so, but I do hope it impacts. So, so we would have some insights on this. What we do know is that actually people who are aware about the urgency have taken action already, but them having taken one type of action out of, let's say, 18 that we survey, would actually reduce sometimes intention to take further action, because they sort of checked the box of doing something about it. So maybe prioritizing which actions, because we know the effectiveness of different actions, let's say information seeking versus, I don't know, making some really significant changes to your house, or even moving furniture upstairs with floods, right? So it would have a different impact in terms of damages experienced. So prioritizing which actions, prioritizing communication about the most effective actions, and actually, because we might use this open window of desire to adapt only probably once, once in a while at least. Yeah.
Yeah, okay. There's a few questions here about the modelling side of your work, and in particular one about how you've validated them and whether they've been validated in real world data. And I think you have actually presented some of that, but some of the global work that you identified, how's that been validated?
Yes, yes, all models. So the only model that is not yet validated is the one about firms. So, and we are going to apply it to 4 cases in the next 1.5 years. So this is now a stylized model. The rest of the models that we have been working about floods, household mitigation actions, farmers, they have been all validated and parameterized with real data. So we use usually survey data to sort of micro-validate the behavior heuristics that we code in. And we compare the aggregate trends to something what we are observing. So it's a very thorough validation actually that's happening. Okay. What maybe just one point. So the major point is that maybe what we, how would you see validation given the new normal that climate change caused us? So because this behavior simply may change because we are not reacting marginally to the change in probabilities and severity.
Yeah, that raises a really interesting question because we're in a state of change, which is not just a snapshot, it's actually ongoing change. And so that challenges the modelling methodologies that you're using. And do you want to comment on that as to where the developments in modelling are actually bringing a greater understanding of change over time?
Yes, thank you, Judy, for the opportunity. I think actually I would like to stress that actually the types, it's actually extremely important to try this in models, because what you normally do is you run multiple scenarios of behavior also and interaction and how social institutions change or don't change over time. And coming back to what Harry asked about governments and the lobbying groups, you could in principle also try to see how everything evolves in the presence of lobbying or not. So I think what is being done is actually these types of models are always run with multiple assumptions, testing multiple scenarios about what behavior actually takes place and how it changes over time.
Yeah, that's really interesting. There's another question here that is about what we've learned from adaptation behaviors and how that might translate into mitigation behaviors. Whether or not, I know you've worked in both adaptation and mitigation. Have you got any reflections on that?
Yes. Yes. Well, I guess maybe let me start with, I think the biggest difference between mitigation and adaptation as far as, let's say, private actors are concerned is in the fact that when we talk about mitigation, there could be some short-term benefits to private actors as well. Let's say if you're a household and if you want to invest in solar panels, you will have a payback. It will pay off in 3 to 5 years, right? So, and after that, you will actually have pure profits. We're talking about nudging people into something good, and they also feel good because it appeals to their environmental values. When we talk about adaptation, it's about sharing costs. So there is, simply speaking, nothing good there. So it's about choosing one of the two evils, right? So choosing between the two evils, and that makes a huge difference, I think, because for people even to start thinking about adaptation, so they're much more actually around the world, people are willing to change their behavior to help with mitigation, and then I don't think they're thinking much about adaptation yet unless they're directly exposed.
Okay.
Yeah.
Because people learn, but not necessarily embed that learning into behaviours. So we've had a lot of intention surveys around what people intend to do, and not so much about what people have actually done. And I know there's a whole literature around that, which I'm sure you're familiar with, but I just wonder where that idea is going in the behavioural sciences around translating what one has learned and embedding it into action, either at the individual firm or government level.
Mhm. There are a few different streams of let's say research going on in that direction. This is what's called intention behavior gap, sort of the gap between intending and actually doing something.
Yep.
And indeed, it's present. It is present. But for example, there have been already a few years ago a paper, I think, in Nature Climate Change, that looked at intentions, actually households willing to take action on mitigation. And we saw that they actually showed statistically from the empirical data that those who did experience heat waves and floods in the UK, that study was done in the UK, were much more willing to mitigate, to take action on mitigation, because climate impacts sort of came home to them. And so that's one option of learning. So what I showed with the market, for example, in the flood zones, so people might be understanding something about probabilities, but they're not acting because they see nobody else reacting to that, right? But at the moment, when there is a market signal, and let's say if we would have a developer or a spatial planner there, they would also see that some areas simply become not attractive for further development. So investments would move out, and probably you would do spatial planning or any version of that the government could take differently, given the change in demand. And this is something what households would understand immediately.
Yeah, and I think it would be interesting to reflect upon the catastrophic climate extremes that have occurred just over the last month in Europe, and the extent to which that experience stops people from acting, in the sense that it's traumatic, and whether, you know, at what point do people actually embed that learning from that, or is it just so big that they are rendered unable to do anything? Have there been any reflections about that?
There is a lot of research, of course, and now actually in a week from now, or I think maybe 10 days from now, in the Netherlands, there is going to be a session about the recent floods, of course, the summer floods in the Netherlands at least, and with also with the reflection what has been happening in Germany and Belgium as well. There's been a lot of, it was really a wake-up call, I think, this summer in many parts of the world. It's not only floods in Europe, but of course all the wildfires in Europe and everywhere, right? So I guess there are maybe what's important, of course, people react. People do change behavior when they face this type of events, but that, whether it's just a temporary behavior change and whether everything will be forgotten again in 5 years, or whether it's actually a permanent shift in values and perceptions and so on, worldviews probably, depends very much on what governments do. Because let's say if we take floods, let's say government refunds everything and rebuilds everything as it was doing in the past and keeps protecting at no costs to the direct beneficiaries. That means that people would just simply say, okay, wow, that was bad. Of course, there will be traumatic events for those who not only lost property or had financial damages, but had emotional trauma and probably loss of life in their close community or families. That is different. But with respect to financial loss, so they would simply forget about it because it's recovered and everything is back to normal. Yeah. If government has also taken an action by saying that we are not going to rebuild, or not going to rebuild in the same way, or not going to rebuild only at the cost of the taxpayer, and have different risk sharing mechanisms instantiated, that would make a difference.
Yeah. Okay, I think Harry's got a question.
Yeah, I was intrigued by your comment about behavioral change and mitigation versus behavioral change and adaptation. And you said, you know, one was a cost. But in actual fact, in some instances, and I wouldn't like to exaggerate it, there can be a benefit to adaptation. And I wonder if you've done any work that looked at the other way around. At what point will individuals decide that, for example, a change in climate is sufficiently certain for them to adapt their business to take an opportunity. So it's literally the other side of what you've been doing, which is the fear side. But what about taking advantage? And have you done any work on what it takes for people to change their behavior to take advantage of in those circumstances where there could be business opportunities from a different climate?
Gary, thank you so much for raising this question and giving me the opportunity to clarify what I meant. So I guess in general, if we are now talking about, let's say if you ask a person on the street, that's and the immediate reaction would be adaptation is costly. Why would I even do anything? My status quo is so nice already. So why would I think about something in 20 or 50 years from now, or maybe 30 years from now? They also don't believe that this is going to happen. Let's say the Netherlands is the country where, where a lot of territory and a lot of people are at flood risk. And I don't know why I'm the only one asking real estate agent when I'm now searching for a house, whether the house is flood prone, they laugh at me. So, but except this side note, what I wanted to say is that it's probably about discounting it all. So, on the household side, on the firms side, I think it's actually the fact that G7 countries made compulsory disclosure of climate risks now enforced, and it will be enforced in the next few years, is really a game changer, because now firms in general, businesses and also farmers who operate as businesses, they are quite rational about their investments, and there are multiple benefits of adaptation. So I actually think that adaptation is extremely beneficial. We would see also, especially if we also do estimates over several decades, we see major benefits of adaptation, and also something what's called resilience dividend or adaptation dividend for also private actors. And in fact, I should even maybe summarize it as one phrase. I think it's the only way, adaptation is the only way for firms also to survive.
Yeah, and I think that moves on to another question that somebody has asked here, that it's sort of this flip side of the negative and the impact of the negative and so on. And it's around, you know, how do we motivate behaviors ahead of damage or ahead of impact and experience of floods and fires and all the other impacts? And that's a different kettle of fish altogether. And there have been the use of serious games to help do that. I know in Netherlands that's been something that's been used, and I just sort of wondering the extent to which the behaviour change, the behavioural factors that influence whether you anticipate something as opposed to waiting until it happens has been researched. And I'd like to comment on that.
That's a good question. So there are indeed serious gaming and virtual experiments where people actually put in a virtual reality settings with these large screens or glasses and etc. And they are led through their familiar neighborhoods, but under specific climate extreme scenarios, is one of the ways indeed to elicit what they would do, understanding what it actually implies, what the climate change future actually implies. But if we talk about more larger scale studies, which usually be done not in the lab with this, I don't know, 10, 50, 30 people, but for the larger population and also just the layperson, citizens, the lay citizens, they're usually done through surveys. And then there are also hypothetical scenarios. They're called usually choice experiments, where people are presenting in very simple terms, let's say, few alternatives, and they allowed it to choose what they would do. Whether they actually going to take the action which they are planning or not would only be possible to trace if you do monitor the same respondents over time, practically. So which is started to be done.
Yeah. I think there's quite a bit of interest amongst the audience about how New Zealand could collaborate with on the sort of work that you do. We have a very interested local government group of people online, and we're, as I'm sure you're aware, we're really keen to share knowledge and look for opportunities and offer up sites for experiments that could actually motivate and help the decision makers on the ground.
I think it would be really wonderful to do this, and I will be very happy to discuss specific maybe cases and how it could help, and definitely also learn from your experience, because New Zealand is really a front runner among governments worldwide, I think, in terms of taking the climate action seriously. And I think, of course, also and maybe one of the few governments that are really proactive indeed, as you also the question back to your previous question. So we really have to take proactive action on everything. It shows repeatedly that the more you postpone, the more you increase more or less the sunk costs of maintaining the status quo, because the status quo is not going to continue given all the trends which the physical science shows us. So I will be very happy to explore specific collaborations, and also for me, I guess it's as for every scientist, I think probably we feel it as a as our citizens' obligation to also contribute to actually changing something in the real world, not only.
Yeah, I just want to signal to the audience that we are able to go over about 10 minutes, if that's okay with you, Tatiana. 5 or 10 minutes, and which we're into already. And so if people want to stay, you're very welcome to. So Harry, have you got any other questions you want to pick up from the audience? Well, you're on mute.
Yeah, I've got it now. There are a couple of questions around the ability of your research to influence policy decisions. And I know you said you're not a policy maker, but do you have, any feeling or intuition around how your research is influencing decisions made by policymakers?
Yes, thank you, Harry. So in fact, some 10 years ago, I only worked part-time at the university, and half of my week I spent at Deltares, which is the Dutch research institute attached, which works closely with the Ministry of Environment and Water Management. So so I have seen the other side, and I know also that maybe the real policy making requires very agile, very quick response, and etc. So so for me, so the methods that I'm using are rather new. So I have been working also with other models, like typical optimization models, typical cost-benefit analysis, and so on. But I guess for me, maybe my heart lays with something that goes beyond that, and we know there is some grandfather with respect to practice, also what is being used in terms of models. And what I do see is that the types of micro level disaggregated models and behaviorally rich models, like agent-based models and other types of network analysis and so on, has been increasingly used also for policy advice. So what impact do these insights eventually have on the actual policy making? I think are very difficult to measure. My impression is also that it's usually a process. The policy making process is usually a process where there are different stakeholders involved with different stakes, and there are also power games a bit in terms of what solutions. Sometimes solutions are known in advance. Let me, at least I don't know that that's not always the case, but there are preferred solutions by lobbying groups, perhaps, and it's not about then the method, but it's about which one shows the right. It could be this way. It could go this way, but I'm quite actually optimistic, and I've been collaborating with Deltares after I left it, And we also worked on other projects with the EU Commission. I was in the group of scientists advising the EU Commission last year about a bit different subject, but also behavioral change and sustainability transitions. So I see that policymakers are very, very curious in understanding and in finding the methods that would help them also go beyond the standard tools of only cost benefits, but also trying to understand what happens if we will also want to tip in, let's say, in nudging behavioral change, for example. And I think that is just something what I see happening. To what extent it would actually influence, I don't know, but what I know that it would give a wider range of scenarios possible and maybe policy instruments possible, and it gives a test bed to understand what influence would specific policy instruments have rather than the others.
Yeah, I think this is where the relationship between the formation of research projects that have relevance for the practitioners and have very interesting modelling components to them, which can, interact together. And one of the areas that we exercise our minds a lot on in New Zealand is around infrastructure. And infrastructure providers are providing decisions today for a very long time,
yes,
up to 100 years and more. And once you've made a decision today, it's sort of locked in for some time. So there's a question here about how can the behaviours of be factored into those sorts of decisions, those very long-term decisions. And of course, you have those in the Netherlands.
Yes, thank you for the question. Indeed, so for example, in the Netherlands, I actually lead the community of 4 Dutch technical universities that work on the resilience of coupled social, technical, environmental systems. So we have a team of, I don't know, several tens of scientists from different backgrounds, and we work closely also with several cities in the Netherlands in terms of their long-term infrastructure investments, and several infrastructure providers like the railroad and etc. Indeed, these decisions are very important, and what we are, so the discourse here is that we have to shift from risk as the decisive factor in this infrastructure decisions into resilience, which actually embeds the possibility of having hazards, the possibility of multi-stakeholder decisions happening and self-organization happening at some point. So we discuss, I don't think we have time to do this, but I would point maybe you to the 40U Resilience website, and we do work indeed with practitioners, and there are different multiple case studies that some of our staff is working to actually combine this expertise from social scientists and engineers to indeed look into how to not make investment decisions in infrastructure that indeed stays there out for decades, if not hundreds of years. Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much, Tatiana. I think we're going to have to move on and finish because it's getting late. And I just want to say to the participants that there's a lot of really interesting questions here, and we have those, and we'll keep them and take those into account in our thinking. And also we hopefully can continue our relationship with you, Tatiana, and our links. And if the local government people, particularly in infrastructure people, want to make contact, we can make your details available. So, but thank you very much. And I'll hand back to Charlie. It's been great to have you with us.
Yeah, thank you so much, Tatiana, for taking the time to join us today. It's been a huge privilege to hear from you and learn more about your experiences. And thank you to Judy and Harry for taking us through the session today. And thanks to everyone who joined us. Enjoy the rest of your day or evening, depending on where you are. I'm going to hand over to Bevan now to close the session with a karakia.
Kia ora. He honore, he gloria ki te atua, he mai ngā rongo, ki te mata o te whenua, he whakaaro pai ki ngā tāngata katoa. Hāngai e te atua, he ngā kauhau, ki roto ki tēnā o mātou, whakatongi ato wairua tapu, hei awhina, hei tohu i a mātou. Kia tau te rangi Māori e, kia tātou katoa, hau pai mariri. So in English, that's all honour and glory to our Maker. May peace and tranquility reign throughout the earth. Goodwill and thoughts to all mankind. Creator, establish within each of us a wholesome spirit. Let your spiritual being grow within us to help us. May peace and goodwill be with us all. Kia ora tātou. Thank you.